Chapter 25. A pan of dirty water flung in his face brought Schaefer around. As the cool wetness shocked him back to consciousness, he heard a voice saying, "Time to wake up, puppy dog." Schaefer blinked and looked around. He was sitting in a low wooden chair, feet on the floor and his knees sticking up, his wrists tied behind him with something stiff. It felt like coat hanger wire. Whatever it was holding his hands, it was strong and tied tight. He couldn't even come close to snapping it, couldn't slip it off. Schaefer, if that was who was responsible, wasn't taking any chances. His arms were bound to the chair's back with plain rope. The chair stood near the centre of a fair-sized, dimly lit room, one with plank walls and a plank floor. It wasn't any place Schaefer recognised. Daylight was coming in under the eaves. There were no windows or lamps. He guessed he'd been out for hours, maybe days, long enough for Schaefer's men to drag him back to whatever they were using for a base anyway. Whoever had clouded him had known what he was doing. Schaefer had a headache, but his thoughts were clear enough. He didn't think there was any concussion. He wondered where the hell he actually was, and how hard it would be to get out. If they'd hauled him all the way down the full length of Panama, and this was the Cali camp just across the Colombian border, and if the DEA reports were right, the place was a goddamn fortress, and his chances of escape were right up there, with the odds of St. Peter giving Hitler the benefit of the doubt. If this was some little cabin somewhere along the smuggling routes, though, he might be okay. He'd beaten a monster from outer space. He had no interest in dying at the hands of a bunch of drug-dealing punks who claimed to be members of his own species. The man who had splashed him tossed the empty pan at Schaefer's feet with a clatter. Then he checked the wire on Schaefer's wrist, gave it a twist to tighten it further, and said, "Bueno." Schaefer felt the metal biting painfully into his flesh, felt blood start to ooze from beneath. He growled in anger and pain. "Perhaps the wire is too tight," the man said in good English. "Not to worry. We're only just beginning. In a little time, you won't even notice so minor a pain." He turned, leaned out the room's one and only door, and signalled to someone Schaefer couldn't see. A moment later, a taller man in military fatigue stepped into the room. He nodded a greeting to the man who had splashed Schaefer. The first man saluted and left the room. The new arrival crossed slowly to a spot beside the chair, where he stood and smiled down at Schaefer. Schaefer knew the face. He'd seen it before, back in the Big Apple. Seen it, hell. He'd been tempted to punch it in. This was Schaefer. Schaefer took a certain pleasure in seeing that Schaefer limped as he walked. "Detective Schaefer," Schaefer said. "I'm hurt. You came all this long way to Central America. You part so close to my home, and you didn't stop by to pay your dear old friend a visit." Schaefer grunted. "Perhaps you sought me, but were misled," Schaefer suggested. "You made a wrong turn somewhere. Someone gave you faulty directions. After all, what else could have brought you to this corner of the world but a desire to renew our acquaintance?" "Somehow I managed to avoid that particular desire," Schaefer said. Schaefer grinned. "The last time we met, I made you a very generous offer. Perhaps now you're sorry you responded as you did." "I'm only sorry we didn't meet on a taller building," Schaefer snarled. The grin vanished. "That's very funny, Detective Schaefer," Schaefer said. "You've always had a good sense of humor, haven't you? I regret I won't be able to appreciate it very much longer." Schaefer turned as the other man re-entered. He was holding something in one hand, something black and bright orange. In his other hand was a coil of black cable. He was paying it out as he entered. He held up the black and orange object. "Black & Decker," he said. "Very sharp." It was a power saw, circular blade, 1/2 horsepower motor. The safety shield had been removed. Schaefer didn't like that. For one thing, it meant this place had electricity, which meant it was more than just some stopover on the trail. Schaefer smiled again. "I'll be back in a bit, after Paolo's had a few minutes with you alone. Perhaps you could entertain him with more of your amusing stories." He saluted sardonically, then turned and limped out. The sadist with the power saw grinned. He revved it a few times just to test, and light glinted from the spinning blade. "So little time, so much to do," he said. He circled around behind Schaefer, put a hand on his head, and pressed, tipping Schaefer's head down and exposing the back of his neck, like a barber preparing to trim the hairs there. Paolo revved the saw again, then clicked the switch into the lock-on position. The blade and motor settled into a steady hum. "Yeah, I know the feeling," Schaefer said, and he leaned farther forward, pulling away from Paolo's hand. Then he pressed his feet against the floor and stood up, chair and all. One of the back legs caught Paolo in the kneecap, hard. "What?" The Colombian torturer staggered back, limping and startled. Schaefer squatted and then threw himself backward, smashing Paolo against the wooden wall. He drove his wired fists into Paolo's belly. Paolo made a strangled noise, barely audible over the power saw's hum, and doubled over. Schaefer dragged the sharp ends of the wire across Paolo's stomach and felt blood dripping. Then he leaned forward and let Paolo fall. The saw was still running. Schaefer twisted around and pressed the chair back against the spinning blade. The motor howled and sawdust sprayed as the saw cut into the wooden chair, and in seconds Schaefer was able to break free and stand upright. Paolo was stirring, struggling to get up. Schaefer kicked him in the gut, and when he coiled into a ball, Schaefer kicked him hard in the head. Blood sprayed from Paolo's nose across the scattered sawdust. "Fun's fun, Paolo," Schaefer said, "but I don't have time for this bullshit." He put his hands on the floor and stepped back through his arms to get his hands in front of him, then began picking with his teeth at the wire on his wrists. After a moment, he managed to get one end loose. After that, it was easy. His mouth was bleeding in 4 separate places where the wire had cut him, and his wrists were bloody as well, but he didn't worry about any of that. He moved the saw around, then kicked Paolo a couple of times to make sure he was out, and to provide sound effects for whoever was guarding the door. There was no reason to think Paolo and Echeverria had been alone. After all, there were the 4 men who had brought him in. They were probably still around, and there might be others. Then he took a flying leap, booted foot first at the closed door, hoping it wasn't any stronger than it looked. It wasn't. The latch and upper hinge gave, and he tumbled through to find himself sprawled on top of a startled guard. The guard was holding a Kalashnikov. Schaefer punched the guard in the jaw and tore the gun out of his hands, then looked around. He was in an empty corridor, with a door at each end and 3 doors on either side. He just emerged from the center of one long slide. That was bad. It meant a bigger building than he had hoped. This place was definitely more than just a way station. Schaefer figured that his only chance to get out of this alive was to disappear into the jungle and make his way back to somewhere civilized, somewhere he could get a plane back to the States. That would probably take weeks. And the bigger this place was, the harder it would be to slip away unseen in the first place. Well, it wasn't as if he had a choice. The guard on the floor was moaning. Schaefer brought the butt of the Kalashnikov down on his head, and the moaning stopped. He didn't risk shooting, though. That would draw too much attention. He looked at the 7 closed doors, saw daylight under the one at the left end of the corridor, and headed for it. The narrow strip of daylight wasn't broken by the shadows of feet. If there was a guard, he was standing to one side, not directly in front of the door. Schaefer put an ear to the wood and heard voices, but he couldn't make out words, couldn't tell who they were, how many, or how far away. Cautiously, he lifted the latch with one hand, weapon held ready in the other. Nothing happened. He swung the door inward as quickly and silently as he could and stepped through, and froze. A dozen men were waiting for him, rifles trained on him. He was facing a broad, open courtyard with no shelter, nowhere to hide, and nowhere to run. The courtyard was surrounded by solid tile-roofed buildings of stucco or adobe, separated by narrow alleys. Watchtowers stood at the corners, watchtowers equipped with searchlights and heavy machine guns. This was obviously Echeverria's home camp, the one the DEA intelligence reports had said was staffed by over 100 men, with equipment capable of repelling a full-scale military assault. "It's not going to be that easy, Mr. Schaefer," Echeverria said from behind two of the riflemen. He smiled. "Paolo was careless, as I thought he might be. I know you're a resourceful man, but Paolo was not impressed. Perhaps now he will be, if you've left him alive." Schaefer stared at Echeverria, thinking. They obviously expected him to drop the Kalashnikov and put his hands up, and that would probably be the smart thing to do. But if they were going to kill him anyway, why not try a dash for the gate? He wouldn't make it without a miracle, but miracles could happen, and whether he got a miracle or not, he might manage to take out Echeverria on the way. He hesitated, though. Something felt wrong. It was a feeling he'd had before, both in the jungle and back in New York. Schaefer looked up at the nearest watchtower, where a man in a bush hat had a machine gun trained on him. That wasn't bothering him. A machine gun was worth something, though. But that wasn't what felt wrong. There was something in that general direction, though. Schaefer blinked and stared at the machine gunner. The man's chest exploded in blue-white fire. Half the riflemen turned, startled, at the sound of the explosion. The other half were sufficiently well trained to keep their eyes and weapons on Schaefer. Echeverria was one of those who turned to look, and then turned again as a second white fireball blew the head off the rifleman on his right. "Son of a bitch," he said, staggering on his bad leg, trying to see what was happening. Then a real barrage began, and the riflemen scattered. Other men began pouring from the buildings. The watchmen in the towers had swung their guns around and now began spraying machine gun fire into the surrounding jungle. But Schaefer, remembering the dead monster's camouflage device, doubted that any of the gunners had a clear idea what they were shooting at, or where it was. He noticed that the fireworks came from more than one direction. So the guide had been right after all. The dead one must have had friends, and now they'd come to play. Echeverria was shouting orders at a group of men doing something to a small outbuilding near one of the far corners of the courtyard. As Schaefer watched, the walls of the building fell outward, revealing an anti-aircraft battery. Echeverria really had been ready to fight off just about anything, up to and including a full-scale military assault. But how could he have prepared for what he was up against now? The heavy guns began firing, throwing shells randomly into the bush. "Donde demonios este él?" one of the gun crew shouted. Echeverria's men couldn't see the enemy, and it was spooking them. And in the excitement and confusion, they'd forgotten all about Schaefer. Still, Schaefer hesitated for a moment longer. Even if Echeverria's men were drug-dealing slime, those outer space things had no right to treat them as playthings, animals to be killed for sport. Then a line of white fire stitched across the courtyard, walking up to the anti-aircraft emplacement, cutting men down. And Schaefer realized this wasn't sport. They weren't playing around anymore. They were pissed. The guide had been right. Those things didn't like losing tourists. But on the other hand, they were still doing this up close and personal. They weren't just sitting back and nuking the camp from orbit. And somehow Schaefer didn't think that was because they couldn't. It might not be sport, but it wasn't war either, and he remembered those drunken hunters back home, long ago, pumping shells into that deer. The heavy guns exploded then, distracting him from his thoughts. The shrapnel took down a dozen men. Echeverria had been hobbling about trying to organize resistance, but now he fell headlong into the dirt. After the battery went, the concerted alien fire focused on the watchtowers, and within seconds, 2 of the 4 were flaming ruins. "Jesus," Schaefer said. It was definitely time to get the hell out of there, especially since those things had probably come looking for him. And they'd remember it, sooner or later. And he still had the tracking device embedded in his neck, and they'd remember that eventually too. And Echeverria's men weren't about to waste time on stopping him when they were under this sort of attack. They were too busy staying alive. He turned to the right and ran for one of the alleys between the buildings, hoping it led to a way out. Behind him, Echeverria looked up, dazed. He saw Schaefer running and called out, "Schaefer, His people must have followed him here. It must be them. Schaefer's doing. He raised a hand, pointing after the fleeing Nordamericano. A bolt of blue-white plasma took his hand off at the wrist. Schaefer screamed and rolled onto his back. One of his men, gun in hand, ran up. "Get him!" Schaefer shouted, waving the cauterized stump. "I want him dead! He did this!" The gunman hesitated, looked around, then charged down the alleyway after Schaefer. "He's mine!" he called back. As he vanished down the alley, back in the courtyard, Schaefer looked up at something which crackled and electric sparks danced around it. A monster appeared out of thin air, a monster that walked upright on two legs, but had a face of blank metal and mottled skin, a colour no human being ever had, a monster taller than any man. Something perched on its shoulder, like a parrot on a pirate captain, and swiveled about. And there were at least 3 other monsters, visible now, walking calmly through the fire and smoke that blanketed the courtyard, carrying things like blades and spears. They moved with power and assurance, alert but not troubled. "Mother of God!" Schaefer gasped. 3 red dots appeared on Schaefer's forehead, weaving about for a moment before settling into a precise little triangle. The black thing on the monster's shoulder pivoted and pointed directly at Schaefer's face, and Schaefer's very last thought was to recognize it as not a pet, but a weapon, a gun of some kind. Then it fired. The creature looked up from the smoking corpse, and in a perfect reproduction of the dead man's voice, shouted to the world, "Mother of God!"